So today I want to answer a question that comes up on almost every single home purchase, and that is, how much of an earnest money deposit should be made when making a purchase offer? Now, first of all, this is a companion follow-up video to one I just did recently on the residential purchase agreement. And if you haven't seen that one, it would probably be helpful to look at that first. In fact, right above my head here, the little dot, press that and you can go watch that video first and then come back to this one. Now, to be clear, the earnest money deposit is the check or the amount of money that accompanies the purchase offer. It's the consideration. For any contract to be valuable, there needs to be a consideration. The down payment is a completely separate item. So the question is simple: how much of a deposit do you give to accompany an offer? Okay? Now, if you look, this is the residential purchase agreement. That is on item number 3, finance terms. Number 1A, initial deposit. Deposit shall be in the amount of, and then a dollar amount, and then instructions about how the money is going to get from the buyer to the escrow company. Now, typically and historically in Orange County, the amount for an earnest money deposit is usually 2 or 3 or 4%. And usually, unless it's an FHA or a VA loan, that is substantially less than the down payment. So essentially what happens is the offer gets written, a small amount of money accompanies the offer, and then at some point later, more funds are deposited into the escrow account. But is this the best way to do it? My counsel, in almost every single circumstance, is going to be no. And here's the thinking. As a home seller, and when thinking about, this is really important, when thinking about the offer that you write and negotiating, you always want to put yourself in the position of the home seller and what is going to be attractive to them. Because really, what this thing is, these 10 pages, is trying to make something, well, the better way to say it is, you're trying to make them an offer they can't refuse, right? And hopefully the option isn't a signature or their brains on the contract, as the Corleones did. It's just a signature on the contract. But you think about this. You've got an earnest money deposit of 2 or 3 or 4%. That's what the listing agent expects. That's what the buyer has, or excuse me, the seller has probably been counseled to expect. Let me suggest this, and this is the advice I give to my buyers in almost every circumstance. Whatever your down payment is going to be, that is the amount for the earnest money deposit. In fact, I'm closing an escrow on Tuesday, and it was an all-cash offer, $870-some thousand. That was the amount of money included for the earnest money deposit. Just recently, I closed another transaction with a couple of first-time home buyers. They were getting 20% down as a gift from their parents to help them buy the house. So the earnest money deposit was 20% of the offering price. And you'd put that in right here. If it's an $800,000 purchase and you're paying cash, your deposit should be $800,000. If it's a $1 million purchase and you're putting down $300,000 and getting a $700,000 loan, your earnest money deposit should be $300,000. Now think about the psychology of this. Think specifically about the one that's closing on Tuesday. The offer came in and the buyer was promising to put into escrow within 3 days 100% of the purchase price. Think about what that does in terms of communicating motivation. Think about what that does in terms of communicating the seriousness of the buyer. And it's also easy to imagine the conversation, because both the 20% down one that I was speaking of and the 100% deposit that I was just speaking of, both listing agents called me right after we put the deal together. In 20 years, the one agent had said they had never seen a 20% down purchase with a 20% down earnest money deposit. The other one, the all cash one, he called me just to confirm that I hadn't screwed up the paperwork. This guy's been an agent for 35 years, and you know the number of times he's seen a 100% earnest money deposit? Zero. In fact, he told me that the reason that his seller accepted our offer was specifically because of that. They couldn't believe it. So that's my advice on what to put down as your earnest money deposit, right? Now, a question that always comes up if I'm sitting down with a home buyer and we're discussing this particular strategy that I employ, they will always ask me, well, hold on a second. In fact, the lady with the 100% cash, she really had a heart attack. Hold on a second. Isn't my money at risk? Am I going to lose all my money? Well, that's a really good question. There's actually two answers to that. When you put a house in escrow, there are essentially two periods that have to do with the earnest money deposit and your risk. The first section has to do with whatever other contingencies are involved in the offer. In this contract, there's room for a financing contingency, an appraisal contingency, an interest rate contingency, and an inspection contingency. Those are four things that basically you're making the offer and agreeing to the purchase price subject to an acceptable appraisal, an acceptable mortgage, an acceptable interest rate, or an acceptable inspection. Now, there are different strategies that I'll discuss at some other time about how to handle those things, but as long as you're within that contingency period, 100% of the deposit is refundable. For example, let's say that the offer is written up and for the inspection contingency, now the way this contract is written, pre-printed, the buyer has 17 days after acceptance, unless otherwise agreed to in writing, to complete all buyer investigations. So the pre-printed item on here is 17 days for an inspection contingency. Basically what that means is the buyer has 17 days to do due diligence on the property, and make sure it meets their specifications and requirements. If they find something wrong, they can exercise that contingency, they can back out of the deal, and they get all of their money back. Okay? Now there are some fine lines about that and details, but generally speaking, that's the way it goes. So as long as you exercise a contingency, you can get all of your deposit back, whether it's 2% of the purchase price or 100% of the purchase price. So that's that. Now, what about after the contingency periods have expired? Now that becomes a very different circumstance. At that point, your deposit essentially is in the hands of the escrow company, and it's in the hands of the seller if you default on the contract. Or is it? Let's take a look at the rule book and go all the way to page 8. Item number 21, paragraph B. Item number 1 is remedies for buyer's breach of contract. So that means if the buyer does something that breaches this contract, that whatever's happened up to that point, there's agreements that certain things will happen or certain things won't happen. If the buyer fails to do one of those things or tries to cancel the deal, essentially that's a breach of contract. And if the buyer breaches the contract, the seller has the option to back out of the transaction. So these are the instructions of what happens if after the contingency period something goes sideways or the buyer wants to back out. And this is why the fine print is so incredibly important to know and understand before you even think about going to buy a house. Subclause B, liquidated damages. If the buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. So far, if the buyer breaches the contract, whatever amount they paid as their earnest money deposit, they lose. But if the property is a dwelling with no more than 4 units, one of which buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer. So what does that say? If somebody is buying a home to live in, and it's a 1 to 4 unit property, so it's a single family home or a condo, duplex, triplex, or fourplex. If they're buying the home to live in and they breach the contract, the maximum amount of the earnest money deposit that can be held is 3% of the purchase price. So that means any additional funds beyond that get returned to the buyer. So as far as risk goes, you're at risk of 100% of your deposit, up to 3% of the purchase price if you're buying the home to live in it. Now, if you're buying it as an investment property, it's a completely different thing altogether, and we'll have to talk about that at another time. But think about this. Think about the transaction that we've been discussing that had 100% earnest money deposit. If that buyer had breached the contract, backed out of the deal after the contingency periods or some other thing that happens, she would have got, on the 800 and whatever thousand purchase price, 3% of the 800 and some thousand whatever dollars that she put in. In other words, except for 3%, her money was completely safe. So here's the important point. Your money is going to be sitting somewhere in an account between when you write the offer and when you close escrow. Why not put that money in the escrow account as a negotiating tactic, as a way to lever the strength of your offer to impress the buyer and the buyer's agent? Pretty good advice. Now, this is just one of the many strategies that I use when I'm working with a home buyer. If you'd like to hear more about this strategy or the others that I use, please contact me. You can click on the button right above my head. You can call me at 949-413-2371, or you can email me, michael@housemgroup.com. Thank you so very much. I hope this was helpful and educational for you, and have a great day.